Good morning, everyone. Apologies for our delay today. This is completely down to my ineptitude with PowerPoint and sharing screens, I have to admit. But without further ado...
Say that, it's always the magic of working in a pandemic. We have to learn how to deal with technology, working at home, internet connections. So it's sometimes difficult and sometimes very easy. So it's not any of us.
Just one of those things.
So welcome everyone to the third day and last day of the Global Foresight Summit. This year edition is going beyond uncertainty. And we are organizing this year with the APF and the WFR, the Association of Professional Futurists, and the World Futures Review, Journal on Strategic Foresight. And today we are starting the day, we're kicking off with Amy Cawthorne. She's the coordinator of the Strategic Dialogue and Innovation in the World Health Organization, but in the Western Pacific region. She's an experienced public health professional with a specialist expertise in epidemiology, which in this context of the pandemic and the COVID is quite interesting to mix with the foresight industry and field. And she also has in-depth knowledge of the complex factors that impact and drive change in international and national public health. So she's been working in Southeast Asia, West Africa, and Darfur, and as well as in the WHO headquarters in Geneva. And now she is in the regional office in Manila, in the Philippines. Today, she is going to be talking to us about the case, the Health Futures Strategic Dialogue Unit she is leading in the WHO for the Western Pacific region. So, Amy, welcome. I leave this on your side. I step a little bit back and I put the presentation on the screen.
Thanks very much, Miguel. Just very quickly, to give you a bit of background, I'm not a professional futurist. I'm actually an infectious disease epidemiologist, and I've been working with WHO for a number of years. And one of the tasks that that I've been given and my team's been given is to help WHO support member states with more longer term sort of strategic planning and looking at how they can achieve the very best health and well-being and health systems for the future population that they have in maybe 10, 20, 30 years time. So that's just sort of the context with which we're working. In this presentation, I've been asked to give you a little bit of a flavour of the why is WHO stepping into this area of work, who we are, and that's sort of my team and our wider network of colleagues, what work we've done so far, what we're actually going to be doing with member states in the region, and then how we're going to do it. So I will keep my presentation quite brief to keep to time. Hang on. Apologies for having slight problems moving the presentation. There we go.
Okay.
There we are. So when I'm talking about the area of WHO that my part of WHO serves, so this is the office I work in the Western Pacific Regional Office, it's quite a large area covering from Mongolia down to Australia, part of the Mekong, right through to the Pacific. So it's an incredibly diverse region and extremely sort of subject to the sort of big changes. It's changing rapidly and constantly. That goes from technology to the disease burdens to the societal changes you're seeing. And about 4 years ago, the regional director for the Western Pacific started a dialogue with countries in the region to see what should WHO be doing to help the countries in the region basically become the healthiest and safest that they possibly can. And as part of that, the regional office and the departments of health across the region developed a paper, a vision paper, which is called For the Future. And it's within this vision paper that the seeds of the use of strategic foresight to really propel the work that we do in health into the future was sown. So in this, this document, which describes basically a lot of dialogues that went on between WHO and the countries committed to put the future up front, to adapt to health, well-being and health systems to the dynamic and changing future that the region holds. And there was a real reflection at this point on the fact that a lot of the operational plans that we use to drive health are actually more of a reflection of the near future, or perhaps today, and that they're not very well adapted to even tomorrow, and not to the tomorrows and tomorrows and tomorrows and that future which we're supposedly building towards. And so the countries in the region were asking for support with longer range planning, and to make sure that the investments that they're making now are really building towards the type of future health system that will serve those populations in the future to the best of their abilities. The other thing, and I think this was brought up in a panel I was on the other day, and I think it's been reflected in a number of the presentations that you've seen over the last couple of days, is the fact that the current pandemic has really provided a reminder of the importance of looking into a future that might be a little uncertain, that isn't necessarily built on what happens yesterday or the day before, but should be thought of in a different way so that we can plan differently and be better at being responsive and able to cope with things in the future. And I think that there is an obligation as well as an opportunity created by COVID to both identify those points for strategic dialogues around futures with governments. But I think from the government sides as well, there is a recognition that they also want to be able to do better for populations in the future. So I think COVID has been both that, as I say in the slide, an obligation, but it has also created those opportunities to start that dialogue, particularly with senior leadership in government, because it's much more tangible for them about the importance of it. It's no longer something which may seem rather theoretical, but they can actually see how a longer range understanding of the future will put them in a better place to plan better, to be more resilient. So in terms of the who, so that the previous slides were a little bit about why WHO has stepped into this area. But the who, well, we're a small team in the regional office. There's about 5 of us, and like many of you, we are working virtually together. We're based in Manila, but actually the team is across the world. And then what we've been doing is building strategic partnerships with many of the organizations that you may know and maybe work for, so that we're also creating a network of partners to be able to help us support the countries with their mission to improve the health and well-being for the future populations. The work that we've done has been focused on futures thinking, but also on building out engagement with different communities, because the work that we traditionally do is with technical and policy-making counterparts in governments. But when you're starting to think about the future of health and well-being and health systems, you need to really build out beyond just the expert views and engage more with people in academia, but also community groups and young people. So part of the work that we've also been doing has been about linking with partners in the region who have access to and engagement with different groups other than the traditional policy and technical counterparts that WHO has. In terms of some of the work that we've done so far, we've sort of focused it in 3 areas. First is on engaging. So beyond just the work that we're doing with those policy and technical counterparts in ministries of health, we've also been engaging with communities through various projects around one called SenseMaker, which was looking at micro narratives being picked up by young futurists in the Western Pacific about how they saw COVID shaping and changing the future of health for them. We're about to do something on a visual art exhibit exploring the future. And this actually came from a historic think tank that we ran looking at the trends that the foresight work was showing was shaping the future, but putting it backwards, looking backwards to pandemics and events that had happened in the past, and said, if you were to say, look at social contracts or looking at the way in which populations perceive risk, how have previous pandemics actually shifted that? What evidence have we got for the impact of that? And one of the things that they were saying was that the historians had identified how important art is in describing how non-expert groups, community groups, young people see the impact of big pandemics and epidemics, and their understanding of how it's shaping them, their communities, their view of their own health, the way they interact with society, was expressed through art and theatre historically. So one of the things that we're looking at in terms of capturing these views and thoughts of communities around the future of health and well-being is to look at it also through different media, not just through a very technical approach. So that would be an art exhibit that will be launched within the next month. There've also been a number of crowdsourcing initiatives with young people in the region, looking at how they view the future and those changes and what drivers are changing particular aspects of health. We've also been adapting the strategic foresight approaches that many of you will be very familiar with to fit with a strategic dialogue around the future of health. And we've been running a number of COVID and non-COVID related futures think tanks to get an understanding of some of the drivers of change shaping the future. And we're also starting to look at advocating, and that's working with a pool of experts that we're building up across the globe. We're looking at developing communities of practice, and also later this year, the end of August, we'll be running with Miguel and Fran and colleagues in Fast Forward a Health Futures Forum. So that's in terms of the work we've done so far. In terms of what we're going to be doing with countries specifically, we're looking at creating a strategic dialogue process that will last 12 to 18 months, because we recognize that in order to engage thinking and to create opportunities for futures literacy, a one-hit workshop just won't suffice. So consequently, these futures dialogues with ministries of health across the region will take place over a 12 to 18 months. And they're really looking at asking the right questions to the right audiences at the right time, and using the right strategic foresight tools to drive that thinking. And each country does have a different right time, and there are different audiences in each of the countries as well, depending on what the strategic entry point is. So, for example, in Malaysia, we're going to be looking at the sort of future of aging and looking at it much more in terms of a healthy community rather than through just a health systems approach. So the partners there will be quite different, and the right questions are around healthy aging, and the right time will be sometime later this year. Whereas with Mongolia, we've already started the process, and that's much broader. It's around, sort of health, well-being and health systems in Mongolia for 2050. And that involves a very big stakeholder group that needs to be engaged, and the right time fitted in with needing to operationalize that country's vision for the future, which was around 2050, which was a whole of government vision, if you like, and the health component needed to be built out. So picking those right times, identifying the right audiences with the ministries of health, and really scoping out the right questions is something that we're in the process of doing right now and will be doing in the future. Again, some of the other things that we've been focusing on in terms of the what is that whatever we're doing has to be tailored to country needs and has to be co-created with the national counterparts. Otherwise, it just becomes an international organization driven agenda, and it doesn't lead to the impacts that you really want to see with a long-term strategic foresight approach. We also want to be able to bring in people who can add to the understanding, who can inspire with their experiences and their thinking. So we are working with external experts to develop some of the strategic intelligence to help us refine the tools. And also we're very interested in making sure that within the countries, it's not just driven by the experts. A bit like the work we're doing with young people in the region, we do want to be inclusive and encourage those countries to be inclusive of unreached voices that may not come through the official structures in the country, so that these unreached voices also shape that preferred vision of the future that the countries have, and the way in which that's achieved through a change agenda, or however countries see they want to get to that preferred vision. In terms of the steps, many of you will see this as very familiar. So as I said in my last slide, there are different strategic entry points, and the process really goes through a very familiar process for you futurists. It's looking at trends and the drivers of change, and that's usually done through a series of deep dives into different important trends. There'd then be building out different scenarios, looking at what the preferred scenario is and developing that vision for the future, and then through backcasting, connecting that vision in 10, 20, 30 years back to today. And the output by country is incredibly flexible. Some countries will go into great detail. It might be a 20-page document or 30-page document with a lot of detail. Others may choose to have a 28 commitments, and others may go for something even more high level of sort of a 10 agenda for change document. But the important thing is that it's that vision backwards to today with the big steps required from those countries to invest in actions that make sure you're on track for achieving that vision. And that's the process that we're working with in countries and tailoring how we get that buy-in with the different audiences in a different way, depending on the country needs, the context, the politics, and all of those things, to ensure that we have the impact that we want to have. In terms of the countries where we're currently working, we've started already with Mongolia 2 weeks ago with a kickoff workshop, and that's likely to be a process over the next probably about 14 months. We're beginning a process in Malaysia and also one in the Philippines. And we look forward to working more with inspirational people from around the world to help us with these processes and supporting these countries, but also in the years to come to offer the same support to other countries in the region. So with that, I would like to thank you all very much for listening. And let me see. And to answer, answer some of those questions. Oh my goodness, there's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, perfect. You have a lot of questions actually in the comments. So we've been talking a little bit. I can put some of them on the screen starting from the beginning. So you have Sally celebrating the work that you're doing and can wait to hear the presentation. So Actually, there is a question here from Amos. Amos is from the Finland Future Research Center of the University of Turku, if I recall correctly. You see the question on the screen, right?
Yeah. I think that if I'm getting this right, Amos, and if I'm not, please do comment again. You're asking whether or not we're using the bespoke tools, and that's very much the approach. You know, WHO working with the counterparts in these countries, the relationship has been there for many years. And so there is a history of trust to do with lots of other activities that we do. But what's really important in the way that we want to bring people with us, and this is also about our country offices as well, many of whom are not experienced in this strategic foresight, is instead of coming with a cookie cutter approach that says, right, here's the toolkit, here are all the annexes with everything, go off and be successful. It's about building a relationship both with our country office counterparts, but with, in most countries, they've chosen to have some sort of task force of maybe 6 or 7 people from across the Department or Ministry of Health. Perhaps it includes also some allied professions. And together we work on identifying from the plethora of ways of doing things and tools, what would make sense in that context, what will help bring an understanding of what we're trying to do to that audience in the best possible way. And it's not just about teaching them about foresight in a theoretical way. So part of it is that through this 12 to 18 month process, we build in some of the capacity building and learning as they're doing. Because one of the challenges with dealing with a predominantly scientist, medical audience is if they can't see one and do one almost at the same time, sometimes you lose that connection. And I'm speaking partly from my own way of thinking as an infectious disease epidemiologist. So I think that's why we've taken a slightly different route, and we're working with experts in the field like SWAF, other people from other sort of futures experts in the region, some of whom will be listening on, and Sally's someone that we've also been engaged with, to bring in that legitimacy and that credibility in this area. And we found that bringing in these sort of expert voices and advice has actually created an enormous amount of excitement and has inspired our counterparts in the ministries of health.
It's great because you know that one of the things that we learned when we work with you, Amy, it's something that Sally is also highlighting here, is that connection between the history, the past, and the dialogue on how are you using those methods closely related to the arts or the social sciences, and you include that into the foresight methodology.
Well, maybe I'll reflect a bit on why we ended up doing that, because it wasn't I've got to be honest, it wasn't initially in the plan. It came about because we ran these futures think tanks to look at, you know, what we're experiencing with COVID and how is this going to potentially radically shift the environment for health in the next 5 years. So we took a much shorter time frame. And the groups there were 5 agile think tanks working over 3 to 4 weeks. And when we came to the end of the process, some of the potential drivers of change and the subsequent scenarios seemed implausible to our colleagues, because they were sort of suggesting potential seismic changes. So we were struggling with communicating how you don't always go for the middle road or the easy option, that some of the scenarios are legitimate, but could be quite challenging to deal with. So we thought, how best to communicate this to people who might be a little bit reluctant to see futures and foresight for what they are, that might see it as not being scientific enough or data-driven enough. So we convened a historic think tank of some of the world's most eminent researchers looking back in history at the impacts of pandemics and epidemics. And we're talking about people who've studied, the Manchurian plague, who've studied, the plague in Egypt and flu epidemics, Ebola, all sorts of things in the near and ancient past. And we got them to test what our futures think tanks had suggested could happen against what history tells us has happened. And it became a very important driver of helping us, of getting our message out and making it understandable for people who feel much more comfortable if you can give them a statistical model, even though those are not, infallible and are built on assumptions. But somehow that's more comfortable than saying, we've had this process and these are the drivers and these are the possible scenarios, even if that process is very logical. And through that experience with the historians, they opened up this world of thinking around the importance of art, the importance of young people's views, and how young people see life very differently. Even historically, the young people's views of what would happen in the future were often more accurate than the 50, 60-year-old, predominantly men in those days, view of what would happen who were driving policy and decision-making. So just a little bit of a background as to why we started to explore a more expansive view of different voices.
No, and it aligns perfectly with all the themes of the future cone going into the future, but also the cone that it's coming from the past, because the farther we go into the past, the more confused it gets, the same way as it goes into the future. We have another interesting question here from Michaela. You see it on screen?
Oh, do you know what, Michaela? I'm not sure I can actually answer that with any authority, because I have to say that I've recently come to the foresight world. So my experience is very much just in probably the Asian region, because we haven't expanded to the Pacific. So I'm not sure I'm best placed to say whether or not there's anything unique. What I would say, though, is that one of the things that we are recognizing is that in getting the messages across, that certainly in the Asian region, art and creative ways of displaying the outputs of their thinking and describing the way the future will look are much more successful than I would have predicted. And we're finding that this is going to become an important part of how we engage people and help people understand and simplify what they're actually doing. Because a lot of people have made the idea of doing strategic foresight sound terribly complicated with all these words like wind tunneling and I don't know what else, even the futures wheels cause some confusion. So a focus on the methods. And so the way in which we've started engaging illustrators in the process as well to help people on the journey of their own personal change and thinking.
Indeed, that is one of the most interesting things, and both Meredith, Sally, and Amos are talking on the chat about what is that fascination that futures literacy and foresight can be applied as a field to many different fields together. And if you go into the anticipatory thinking and methodology proposed by the UNESCO Futures Literacy, it talks about anticipatory thinking, both for futures and for emergence, and how that comes out of biology, basically. So we are prone to be anticipating things, and you can mix it to many different fields without even knowing that you are applying foresight. So that is probably what you were doing when you said at the beginning, I'm not coming from the foresight industry, I don't know a lot about this field, but indeed, you are actually creating a unit, you are touching governments around Asia, and you are encouraging them to use foresight.
Absolutely. I think sometimes when you're encouraging that use, it helps not to have come from that field, because I can understand their questions and anticipate some of their questions because I had them too. And it's a journey. And I think part of what we've got to do more of is linking up the people we're working with in countries with some of the inspirational global community that's out there for futures and foresight. Because the initial delve into this in Mongolia, we actually had people clapping at the end of short videos from people around this region and beyond who were talking about the application of strategic foresight to health and to other aspects. So I think that's one of the things that we are very much looking forward to, is to start to connect with some of you who I'm sure are listening into this talk.
And we have one question here from Derek, but I'm not sure if it's something that you can answer. Because he's talking about the Moldova project.
This one I couldn't answer. This would be in our European region, who would be working on a WHO financial process. What I can say in terms of health financing is that this is one of the areas where we are starting to build relationships with groups that are looking beyond just short term. And we need to strengthen this as part of our dialogues, because you can have the most amazing visions and the greatest, agenda for change out of it. But if you cannot finance and fund it, it will never be realized. And some of the options that countries will want to look at will need to look at different financing models and different things that maybe we don't even do now. And I think that's something that in this piece of work, we're looking to build out, because in each of those dialogues in Mongolia, Malaysia, Philippines, there will come a point in the process where we have to look at, right, this is amazing. This is the direction you want to go in. Now, how do you look at the way in which you finance, and you maybe change the way you finance to ensure that you can cover the costs of each of these steps? So if I can sort of twist the question a little, because I can't specifically answer that one, as outside our region. I think this is an area which often doesn't get enough focus in the sort of government strategic foresight pieces of work that I've seen.
And to close and wrap the session, I want to highlight this comment from Sally. You know this. I mean, this was published in The Lancet, one of the, if not the most relevant health publication in the world. And it's you, Malika, Jessica, writing about your approach on foresight to health professionals, which is not often happening. Because I believe, I did a quick search on The Lancet, and there is very, very, very little reference to foresight in the whole publication. It is the first one I saw, and I read it, I think even before we started to talk to each other.
Yeah, this is one of the challenges, I think, Miguel. It's certainly in the health arena, is that normally it's disease focused, and it's based, their idea of foresight and prediction is modeled. It's a statistical model that looks at how many more cancer cases, liver cancer cases you'll have in 20 years versus now. And I think we've got to push the health sector out of this approach. You keep that because you need it for other things. But if you want fit for purpose, health systems that meet the needs of the populations that will be living in those countries in 20 to 30 years, we have got to change those conversations.
Yeah, so we wrap up with another question from Sally, because now it's interesting.
I think, Sally, to answer your question, we're at the start of that conversation. And if we are successful, and I think this has to come with the financing discussion, you end up at the end having this, you know, my heart wants this amazing vision for 2050 and health. But I've got my head with the financing side saying, right, if we're going to achieve this, we're going to have to disinvest in certain things and invest more in others. And we may need to invest more in things that don't immediately provide us with a result. What was refreshing in the last workshop that we held was that thinking had started to happen, where there was a collective thinking about where they were heading in 20 to 30 years. And they'd started to have that discussion about, well, that means we've got to invest more in things we haven't traditionally invested in, because we're meeting the needs of a budget cycle or a political cycle. And actually, the level of investment in things like data lakes and IT, because if you see yourself having whole genome sequencing based personalized medical care in 30 to 40 years, you have got to have a very comprehensive approach to your digitalization and IT. And that may not show big changes in your, I don't know, disease numbers, if that's how they're identifying these, or maternal mortality in 3 years. So I think that part of the process we're doing with countries is to take them out of the comfort zone, to get them to think not about solving the problems of today with a patch, but actually making sure that in 5-10 years time, those are not even problems, because you've built the infrastructure to be able to deal with them. But it is an ongoing challenge. And I think this was raised in the panel the other day about budget cycles and political cycles. And I think with the engagement of the ministries of health in this process, we're sort of co-designing it. That's one of the things we are looking towards as an outcome, is that a shift in the thinking from that short-term solutions to much longer-term solutions. And we're not at the end of any of those processes yet. We're at the beginning. So I will look forward to having that question again, maybe in a year's time, and be able to come back to you with some actual examples.
Okay, so Amy, thank you so much. We need to wrap this here to prepare for the next session. We are actually just a couple minutes late, but the conversation was extremely interesting. So thank you so much, Amy, for your time and showing what you are doing in the WHO office in the Philippines. And I hope you enjoyed both sessions that you were part of during this summit. And I hope the same for the people. So thank you, Amy. And everyone else, we are back like in about 3 to 4 minutes with another session.